Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So now we are going to talk about teaching listening skill. Listening, yeah, is the language skill that is used most frequently. It has been estimated that adults spend almost half their communication time listening, and students may receive as much as 90% of their school information through listening to instructors and to one another. Since the 1970s, listening comprehension has become an important part in foreign language teaching methodology. Instructional programs expanded their focus on language skills to include listening as well as reading, writing, and speaking. In the 1980s, listening was given special attention and it was incorporated into new instructional frameworks as in communicative approaches. Throughout the 1990s, attention to listening in language teaching increased dramatically. It was an integral part in the language instruction. The underlying principles, one of the current concepts of the nature of listening comprehension, draws on research in psycholinguistics. It defines listening comprehension as the mental processes by which listeners take in the sounds uttered by a speaker and use them to construct an interpretation of what they think the speaker intended to convey, according to Clark and Clark 1977. Most of psycholinguistic literature suggests that proportions are the basic units of meaning involved in comprehension. The listener's ultimate goal, therefore, is to determine the proportions unit of meaning expressed by a sentence, which a speech event expresses. The proportions, however, are represented indirectly in the surface structure of utterances. In order to identify proportions, listeners make use two kinds of knowledge: the knowledge of the syntax of the target language and knowledge of the real word, according to Richards 1990. The yeah This principle is in accord with psychological process of listening, the bottom-up and top-down listening schemata, Morley 2002. In accounting for the complex nature of listening to understand spoken language, it is hypothesized, yeah, that two different modes work together in a cooperative process. One is the externally based bottom-up mode or text-based, while the other is the internally based top-down mode or knowledge-based. In bottom-up strategy, the listener relies on the language in the message, that is the combination of sounds, words, and grammar that creates meaning, whereas in top-down strategy, the listener taps into background knowledge of the topic, the situation or context, the type of the text, and the language. The background knowledge activates a set of expectations that help the listener to interpret what is heard and anticipate what will come next. Let us see how these two kinds of knowledge, syntax and the real world, help the listener identify proportions. First, knowledge of syntax enables the listener to chunk the incoming discourse into segments or constituents. Take, for example, the sentence, John and David usually go to campus on foot. In order to identify its proportional meaning, the sentence would have been chunked into John and David, slash, yeah, usually go to campus slash on foot rather than, or John and slash David usually or go to slash campus on foot. Thus, knowledge of the structure of noun phrases, verb phrases, and the grammatical devices used to express relationship, complementation, relativization, and coordination. In English, help us to segment discourse into the appropriate chunks as part of the process of proportional identification. Consequently, where segmentation is difficult, comprehension is also difficult. This is in line with Clark and Clark's statement 1977 that proportion combines in three different ways, technically called coordination, links or ideas, relativization, qualifies ideas, and complementation fills in ideas. Secondly, to identify proportion, listener can also use the knowledge of the real world. This enables listener to sometimes bypass the constituent identification process. Just take the following examples from Richard's 1977. Number one, sentence. N red cat it chased the ate the. Number two, the cat chased the rat and ate it. Hence, sentence 1 is not understood, while the second sentence is a plausible reconstruction of likely events involving cat and rat. Another conception of listening comes from Worley 2002. He argues that listening is not a passive skill. Listening comprehension is perceived to have three communicative listening modes: bidirectional, unidirectional, and autodirectional. Bidirectional mode means that listening has two-way communicative listening. Here, the reciprocal, the speaker and listener take turns exchanging speaker and listener role as they engage in face-to-face or telephone verbal interaction. The unidirectional is one-way communicative listening. Auditory input come from a variety of sources such as the media, radio, TV, film, instructional situations of all kinds, or public performances, lectures, plays, operas, etc. The auto-directional is a self-dialogue communication in which we may not be aware of our internal roles as both speaker and listener in our own thought process. Sometimes we attend to our own internal language, which we produce as we think through alternatives, plan strategies, and make decisions, all by talking to ourselves and listening to ourselves. The implication in listening instruction is that learners need to have instruction and practice in these three modes of listening. The classroom activities for active information processing. Yeah, it is true that foreign language students often have difficulty to chunk longer oral messages. Although they understand them one by one, they have difficulty to put them together in order to carry out the entire set. What follows are several classroom activities that can be used for practicing verbalization in foreign language so that students can develop their ability to retrieve oral or recorded materials. Number one, oral repetition. It is the most elementary activity in which the students repeat what they hear sentence by sentence or phrase by phrase. The procedure is asking the students to listen to word, phrase, or sentence pattern, and then repeat or intimate it, and then memorize it, often but not always part of the procedure. And then this activity is valuable since it forces the students to segment the stream of sound in some fashion. The auditory image is longer retained, and the students have time to relate segments and to readjust his developing interpretation. Number two, identifying keywords. It is a somewhat more refined type of repetition on a single sentence level. In this activity, students learn to avoid unessential information and to identify and repeat the keywords only initially subject, verb, object, and later other elements. The students may be instructed to jot down keywords as they hear them in a sentence. And then number three, paraphrasing. Another approach to verbalization is the of paraphrase. First, using single sentences and later building up paraphrases or paragraphs. In this case, the students are asked to restate in different words, often words which are simpler and easier to understand. This activity has the advantage of being a more creative activity than just a mechanical manipulation through repetition. And then number four, summarizing. Somewhat related to paraphrasing is oral summarizing. That is, giving the gist of information the students have listened. It involves larger units of material, for example, an entire event or story. This activity therefore allows for greater freedom of self-expression. However, summarizing is usually not an easy task, even in one's own native language. It might be worth having students to develop skill in outlining first before they come to real summarizing. It is in fact that an activity in which the phenomena of chunking come into play on a large scale. Number five, answering question. Another means of verbalizing is to answer questions on the content of the passage the students listen to. It seems important to state here that the question should be focused on the skeletal content of the message rather than on the trivia. Questions can be in many forms, such as question for verification or seeking confirmation that the information was understood correctly. And then number two, clarification, seeking more details or an explanation of an item. Number three, elaboration, asking for additional information on a point introduced in the presentation. And then number four, extension, asking for information on a new point, one that was not introduced in the presentation. Number six, simultaneous listening and reading aloud. This activity provides listening practice by supplying a script for verbalizing along with the listening materials. An additional benefit of this technique lies in a greater perception of the use of suprasegmentals, yeah, especially linking. Since linking often causes comprehension problems for students who have been exposed primarily to carefully articulated talk. Most of the above activities have the underlying principles of listening comprehension that normally people listen for meaning, not for words, according to Clark and Clark 1977. The classroom procedure. It is advisable that the listening lesson consists of three related parts: pre-listening, whilst listening, and post-listening. The pre-listening activities are especially function as warming up exercises or as preparation for listening in several ways. During pre-listening, the teacher may do the following activities. Number one, assess students' background knowledge of the topic and linguistic content of the text. Number two, provide students with the background knowledge necessary for their comprehension of the listening passage or activate the existing knowledge that the students possess, yeah. Number three, clarify any cultural information which may be necessary to comprehend the passage. Number four, make students aware of the type of the text they will be listening to, the role they will play, and the purpose for which they will be listening. Number five, provide opportunities for group or collaborative work and for background reading or class discussion activities. The below are examples of activities described by Yagang 1993, which can be done during stage 1 or pre-listening in a classroom, in a listening classroom. Yeah. Number 1, elicitation of discussion about the topics. Elicitation about the topics of discussion perhaps can be based on visuals, titles, graphs, and etc. Such activities are valuable especially to encourage students to exchange ideas, opinions about the topics. These also can elicit something associated with the topics. Number two, brainstorming. In brainstorming, the teachers can ask students to predict the words and expressions likely to appear in the passage. They then write those words and expressions on the board. The teacher can as well ask students to express predictions about the contents of the passages based on previous knowledge. Number three, guided questions. The teachers in this activity can ask or write questions that help students exploit the passages. While listening activities relate directly to the text, and students do them during or immediately after the time they are listening. There are several classroom activities which can be done during the stage. To compare the passage with the prediction in pre-listening, advanced organizer are students are asked to repeat words, phrases, or sentences. Then students are supposed to complete recorded utterances. Then students are asked to focus on particular sentences and paraphrase them. Then students are asked to give the right order for a given series or of pictures. Then students listen to a passage and take notes on the segments, then answer a particular question. The questions are given in advance, yeah. And then students are given the transcript of a passage with some word missing, and they must fill in the blank while listening. Oh, also, students are asked to match items that have the same meaning as those they hear from the recording. And then post-listening. The post-listening activities function as a closing mark for a listening class. The following are advisable activities for post-listening. Number one, answering questions to show comprehension of messages to multi-choice or true or false questions. Number two, students are given several possible summary sentences and asked to say which of them fits to a recorded text. Number three, writing as a follow-up to listening activities, for examples, letters, telegrams, postcards, messages, etc., related to passages. And then we can also ask students to write a summary with several guided questions. And then number four, speaking as follow-up to listening activities, for example, debate, interview, discussion, role play, etc., associated with the passage heard. So, in conclusion, the teaching of listening comprehension or any other listening skill, language skill, involves considering the objectives of teaching and learning and the micro skills the procedure will cover. Approach to the teaching or listening comprehension should emphasize two complementary processes involved in listening. Richards discusses a model of bottom-up processing as well as top-down processing. The first involves decoding the incoming utterance or message and making use of the linguistic signals actually transmitted. It involves the identification of word structures, grammar, and other linguistic features of the message. The second type of processing involves the listener making use of previous knowledge and information, which is not transmitted in the message, and using this information as a basis for interpreting the message. The classroom activities, therefore, should cover those which help students improve their active information processing skills. Okay, I think that's all from me. Thank you so much for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.